let's get started with this international Dewey Colloquium hosted by Catholic University of Córdoba. This is a sort of panel discussion. By the way, you don't be able to share. We're not able to share because the host needs to give permission to us for that. So the presentation will be by reading or without the slide. Is that okay, or that changes the situation? Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay. The title of this activity is Deweyans in the South, or from the South, Aesthetic Political Theory and Education. We tell Patricia that we are from Argentina and from Brazil. Laura is from Brazil, but she has been working, at Catholic University of Córdoba. And this is, we will present, the format will be the following, okay? There will be 3 speakers, and we will present one after the other, everyone together, okay? So we will present our ongoing research. The idea is that we therefore welcome your feedback and your comments, suggestions, you're everyone friends. And the idea that this is a work in progress. Okay, let's move to our first presenter. She is Laura Haubert, and the title of his talk is Beauty as an Implicit Concept in John Dewey's Art as Experience. I will say something about Laura. Laura is really mad because the Brazilian film doesn't get the Oscar yesterday. But okay, Laura, it's okay. Okay?
Not okay.
But Laura holds a PhD in philosophy from the National University of Córdoba, where she was a doctoral researcher supported by the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, okay? I have to say that in one way or another, we are supported by CONICET. CONICET is the main founding research and public in Argentina, okay? In affiliation with the Catholic University of Córdoba. She is currently a lecturer in undergraduate philosophy programs at Assunção. Is it okay, the pronunciation?
Kind of, it's okay.
Could you, say Assunção?
Assunção.
Beautiful, but impossible to me, okay? Assunção, something like that. Sorry for that. She's also a member of the research group on pragmatism at the Catholic University of Córdoba. Her research focuses on aesthetic and philosophy of art, with particular emphasis on pragmatist aesthetic and the history of American aesthetics. Laura is one of the most talented research scholars in aesthetics, so he works with, for example, Richard Justerman. She doesn't tell that, but it's true, he's a really good friend of Richard Justerman. So, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan, for the kind presentation. Although I don't think it's true. Not that important, but thank you so much. So let me start reading my presentation today. That's called Beauty and Implicit Concept in John Dewey Artist Experience. So in this presentation, I propose to examine a still underexplored aspect of John Dewey, namely the status of the concept of the beautiful in his aesthetic treatise, Artist Experience. Thus far, the secondary literature that has addressed several Deweyan aesthetic concepts, such as, of course, art and aesthetic experience and rhythm and form, has scarcely treated beauty directly, with a few exceptions, such as the works of Eames and Kubala. This interpretative silence may give the impression that the beautiful plays no role in Dewey's aesthetics theory. Yet, although Dewey clearly privileges the concept of art, this does not mean that the beautiful appear or to operate in his text. What is at stake, therefore, is not a simple absence, but rather a distinct mode of presence that deserves examination. Also, so do I believe. What I intend to do here, then, is to redirect the interpretative gaze to understand how the beautiful appears in his work. This is, accordingly, an investigation that is at once historiographical and conceptual, and also very, very new. It's my baby new research. The guiding hypothesis is that Dewey transforms the concept of the beautiful. Rather than preserving it as almost category as in modern philosophy or modern aesthetics, he progressively reabsorbs it into the broader notion of aesthetic experience, dissolving it as an isolated concept. In effecting this shift, Dewey does not abandon the beautiful, rather, he transforms and redefines it with the framework of his pragmatism aesthetics. So, let us therefore examine that happens to the concept of beautiful in Dewey's works. The beauty in artist experience. I would like to clarify that although I have focused here on the concept of beauty in experience, it's worth emphasize that this work is not the only text by John Dewey in which the concept of beauty appears. In fact, it's very present in other writings from his early aesthetics, such as the 15th chapter of his first book, Psychology, as well as
Laura, from time to time,
works from other areas, such as his logic, the theory of inquiry. Here, however, in order to respect the limits of time, I have restricted myself to the work that has generally been regarded as his major contribution to aesthetics theory. I would like to argue in artist experience, Dewey undertake a methodological redefinition, transforming the beautiful from a foundational category of aesthetics into a quality of experience, to the point of dissolving its status as an autonomous concept. The traditional of the beauty is discussed, criticized especially, and ultimately rearticulated with a new framework. So it's worth noting that although it is not the central concept of any chapter of work, the concept of beauty, it's never with frequency. And identifies significant definitions or critiques of the beauty in at least 7 of the 14 chapters of artist experience. And more precisely, I quote in chapters 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 14. Dewey's treatment of the beautiful in this book may be divided into 2 moments. In the first, he mobilized definitions advanced by various philosophers through history, from Plato and Plotinus to Kant and Hume, as well as Herbert Spencer. Those references appear almost invariably in order to exemplify or sign the type of conception of the beautiful that Dewey intends to criticize. What conception is this? Fundamentally, the one that hypothesizes the term, transforming it into a metaphysical object or essence. 2 paradigmatic examples illustrate how this dialogue with the history of aesthetics unfolding in the work. The first is Dewey critiques of Plato, situated with a broader criticism of the cognitivism and intellectualized,
okay.
character attributed to art. So, Dewey turns to the theory presented in the symposium, where beauty functions as a ladder of successive steps that redirect the senses upward, toward the world of ideas. There will thus be a lowest rung of sensible beauty and, at the final stage of ascent, absolute beauty. Dewey remarks in this regard, and I quote, Plato ladder is moreover a one-way ascent. There is no return from the highest beauty to the perceptual experience. End of the quote. For Dewey, the problem lies precisely in this hypostasis of the concept of the beautiful. The classical traditions transform beauty into something that lies behind the realm of experience. As Dewey explains when discussing Plato's ideas, the beauty of sensible things come to be understood merely as a step toward a higher and immaterial. On this interpretation, the beauty present in perceptible object is only, and I quote Dewey here, as a potential becoming of the soul towards apprehension of eternal patterns of beauty. End of the quote. So the idea of beauty as an eternal essence did not end with Plato, as philosophers continue, as seen in authors such as Plotinus and Carlyle and Dewey's quote them. So, a second example concerns Kant. According to Dewey, Kant was a true master at drawing distinctions and then erecting compartmentalized divisions. This mode of approaching experience left its mark on aesthetics as well, where a separation was instituted between the aesthetics and other forms of experience. The result, Dewey argues, is that, and I quote, the psychological road was open, leading to the ivory tower of beauty, remote from all the sphere of emotion. End of the quote. It's worth noting here that Dewey's extend to the concept of the beauty, the broader critics he directs towards Kantian aesthetic theory and the Kantian conception of art, a critique that has already been analyzed by scholars such as Stroud. For Dewey's perspective, Kant isolates the beautiful within a sphere detached from the ordinary conditions of experience, separating from the practical, the emotional, and vital dimensions of life. What Dewey seeks to show precisely is that beauty, just like the fine art, should not be isolated in this position of rupture from life and experience. So, rethinking the beautiful, therefore, becomes one further aspect of Dewey's broader philosophical project of restoring the continuity between art and life. The point, in Dewey's view, is that those theories of the beauty produce abstractions in which it was presented as a transcendent essence, completely detached from concrete experience and removed from ordinary life. In its traditional form, the concept of the beautiful does become a tool for justifying this rupture with life, erecting artificial compartments with experience. Reconstructions of Plato, Plotinus, Carlyle, Kant, and even Santayana indicate first that he was deeply familiar with this tradition, and second, that he does not ignore but confronts it critically in order to distance himself from it. If compartmentalized and sanitized conception of art still prevail, this was largely because it remained intertwined with the idea of beauty as an eternal essence and as a separate realm. It therefore became necessary not only to redefine art, but also to beauty. This redefinition, however, cannot give rise to a new hypostatization. For this reason, the beautiful does not become a central concept in Dewey's theory. Rather, it is understood as an effect or quality of experience. Here, Dewey seems to operate convergence between the concept of beauty and aesthetic experience, such that beauty presents itself whenever the unifying qualities of experience emerge. Taking this seriously means that beauty is not only part of the experience of the fine arts. So, this definition, however, cannot give rise to a new hypostatization. For this reason, the beauty does not become a central concept in Dewey's theory. Rather, it is understood as an effect or quality of experience. Here, do operate a convergence between the concept of beauty and aesthetic quality experience, such that beauty presents itself whenever the unifying qualities of experience emerge. Taking this seriously means that beauty is not only part of the experience of the fine arts, but also part of life experience in a broader sense. Something predefined that we apply to characterize the experience, but rather something that arises from experience. Asks, and I quote, and you can all see in the slides, is beauty another name for form, this essence upon material, or is it a name for the static quality that appears whenever material is formed in of the quote? So this question is significant since it condenses what I believe to be the methodological shift of Dewey's concept of beauty. Beauty is no longer conceived as something imposed from the outside, but as something that emerges when materials are organized in such a way that they become expressive within experience. The concept, therefore, loses its metaphysical status and becomes separable from the process through which an experience acquires form and rhythm. In Dewey's mature theory, beauty does not explain aesthetic experience or aesthetic feeling. The relation is reversed. The beautiful is the name we give to a certain emotional consummate quality of aesthetic experience and functioning, as a descriptive rather than an analytical term. It does not legislate, nor does it offer a list of characteristics, as in various philosophers of the modern tradition aesthetics, because it's derived from the very experience. It may be said to be an effect of the phenomenon of the experience, not an essence, an ideal, or an objectification of the mind. I highlight here what I take to be the most significant passage concerning this redefinition, which you can all see on the slide. I believe this paragraph is particularly important because it contains 4 key ideas for understanding Dewey's approach to the concept of the beautiful. Functioning almost as a summary of his positions, I have tried to reconstruct them here in order to make them clear. First, Dewey explicitly acknowledges the few reference to beauty that appears in his aesthetic theory and notes that, although beauty has traditionally been the central theme of aesthetics, it has scarcely appeared in his own account. In other words, beauty is not the point of departure of his theory. Second, the passage is important because of the metaphysical tradition of beauty, that is, the theories that treat beauty as if it were an essence, separated from experience, as if it were an objective property of things. Third, Dewey briefly explains why he considered beauty to be a problematic concept, arguing that it's not an analytical term that can be classified and examined in detail by philosophical theory, just as aesthetics itself become obstructive for those who wish to approach the arts directly. Beauty becomes obstructive when it is treated as a concept that can be analyzed and defined in theoretical terms. And finally, Dewey concludes the paragraph by offering what comes closest or more closest to a pragmatist definition of beauty. In this view, beauty is simply the total qualitative character of an experience. It is not a property of an response we feel and enjoy when an experience reaches a stage of consummation. In summary, Dewey does refuse to develop a new theory of the beautiful because beauty is, in his view, the term in the aesthetical vocabulary most resistant to analytic framing. Simply put, in one part of experience, it's not a matter of classifying or explaining it, for it does not constitute an experience in itself. The emotional rapture traditionally associated with beauty is an emergent quality, an integral part of a aesthetic experience, not a separate experience. The beauty designates the consummated outcome of that experience, the mark of an experience that has achieved integration and fulfillment. So, aesthetic experience and beauty therefore converge in Dewey's theory. If the beauty does not appear independently, it is because it is not more than a designation for certain qualities of aesthetic experience. Dewey writes, and I quote here, that beauty, which I agree with Mr. Richards, is simply a short term for certain value qualities in being an intrinsic part of the total effect. End of the quote. This formulation
5
reinforces
minutes
the idea.
remaining, Lau.
Okay, thank you. These formulations reinforce the idea that beauty is not a property imposed upon the object, nor a projection of merely subjective pleasure. Rather, it belongs to the object insofar as the object itself is part of an integrated experience process. As we explained, the picture is the outcome of the interaction between organism and environment, and its beauty belongs to it, and I quote, just as much as do the rest of its properties. Beauty is therefore neither purely subjective nor metaphysical transcendent. It's an emergent quality of the experiential whole. Here, it's worth noting a difference between Dewey and George Santayana, which has already been emphasized by Daniel Moreno, a leading interpreter of Santayana's philosophy. In Santayana's theory, beauty is defined as objective pleasure, a formulation that suggests that aesthetic value originates in subjective feeling and is subsequently attributed to the object. Dewey argues in Arta's experience that this definition of Santayana results from artificial separation between organism and the world. Once experience is understood as arising from the interaction between organism and environment, the idea of projection loses its explanatory force. Aesthetic qualities are not psi contents projected onto objects. Rather, they emerge from the interaction between organism and environment. Beauty, therefore, is not pleasure projected onto an object or situation, but pleasure within the experience of the object and the situation, so fully integrated that the object and enjoyment become indistinguishable within the experiential whole. In this way, we can say that in Arta's experience, what emerged is already a radical suspicion toward the concept itself. Dewey dismantled the concept of beauty as an autonomous category. It ceases to function as an organizing, legitimating concept of experience and becomes instead a retrospective label applied to consummate aesthetic experience. Here, we find a complete descenter of the classical concept. This movement of the center, the beauty, is analogous to the one Dewey carries out with respect to the arts themselves. A new framework is therefore required. While art is rethought in terms of experience, beauty is observed into the broader field of that experience. It appears when experience reaches fulfillment, but not as an essence or a separate reality. Let me now move some brief conclusion remarks. The discussion presented here sought to contribute to the conceptual analysis of Dewey's aesthetics theory by focus on an aspect that often remains in the background, the concept of beauty. By examining the concept of beauty in art's experience, we find that Dewey's aesthetic does not eliminate this classical concept, but rather reformulate it. Beauty ceased to function as the foundation of aesthetic theory and instead became the name we give to certain aesthetic experiences that are complete and integral. Beauty is no longer something defined by a set of characteristics. Rather, it is the qualitative expression of an experience that has achieved unity and fulfillment. What early traditions treated as a central concept does become a qualitative moment within the very structure of experience itself. Dewey's theory, therefore, does not abandon the concept of beauty. He redefines it and its reposition with the dynamics of aesthetic experience. Thank you all for the attention.
Thank you, Laura. From time to time, you got frozen, but we follow your reasoning perfectly. We have some minutes now for questions, comments, suggestions. If you don't have question, I will start because okay, Livio.
Please, you start and then I continue.
Okay, Laura, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, we talked earlier about this presentation, but I kept thinking with your answer then. I don't get to know why a pragmatist theory of aesthetic would need a concept of beauty. Okay, I mean, I understand that Dewey is discussing with traditional philosophers, with Kant, with Plato and whatever. But what is the difference, if you could say, of using the concept of beauty in a pragmatist aesthetics? If you want to say, okay, I think that this is the advantage of taking this concept as within the framing of a pragmatist theory of beauty. Because I remember, for example, and I
I
wrap
think
with this. Okay, go ahead. And we have also Patricia after. Okay.
no, I think it's interesting how Dewey presents this idea of beautiful because it's broader than the classical, and I think it responds better when we think about what is, for example, for contemporary philosophers, when we think about the contemporary pragmatist aesthetics like everyday aesthetics or another lines, right? Some aesthetics and this kind of stuff. This is not the classical traditional beauty,
Okay.
but there is also a space of beauty because I think Yuriko Saito is right when she said that we all said that this thing does not matter how we present, but it matters. The cover of the book, it matters. The beauty, it still matters, although we can say that it does not. So I think concept of beauty because we use it, we put in action, and we mobilize this concept. So we should be clear about what we are mobilizing about. I think so.
Okay, we have Livio and Patricia. Livio.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for your talk. I think this is a better formulation of my question on Friday when we talked. I think it is quite clear that Dewey's view on beauty is contextualized within his criticism of traditional metaphysics and in the context of the idea of continuity between primary and secondary experience, at the beginning of experience and nature. My question is this: if beauty is the result of any or every secondary experience, or if it is the result of secondary experience related to the practice of art, making art, or in that particular field. And I take into account your idea, your hypothesis that beauty and this rounding quality tends to converge in this view.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Livio. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's have necessarily something to do with the fine arts. I mean, can be like art as experience can be related to fine arts, and at some point in art as experience, we will say that almost we can have a aesthetic experience from another things, but the fine arts are like the express road to the aesthetic experience, right? So I think there is something similar here when we think about the beauty. It's most common when we think about fine art, but it's part of the consummated aesthetic experience if we take Dewey series, and more things can be considered an aesthetic quality consummation, like the dinner in Paris or the almost accident. So supposedly there is beauty in that thing too, not just in fine arts. But
Okay.
it's something that I'm still thinking about it. Thank you.
Patricia, go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So as I explained, I'm not a Dewey scholar by any stretch of imagination, but I cannot avoid him in relation to cultural value. And in this context, I'm also a bit of a recovering philosopher. I was quite struck when last week we were looking at the living creature chapter in Art as Experience, and I was so struck by, like, on the one hand, Dewey has all of the dislike of metaphysics and dichotomies and distinctions, and yet he struck me as very Kantian, I must say. And what I mean by this is, like, for Kant, there's a reading that, in fact, beauty could be a quality of every experience that had, like, our ability to apply concepts was not so swift and quick, right? So yeah, this got me to think about whether beauty is a moment in experience, quality of experience, as you suggested, or today you said that in fact it's something even more maybe indeterminate. So a roundabout way of asking my question is, if you cannot have a theory of beauty, what does it take for Dewey to be able to theorize I guess, a phenomenon? And I am being self-interested because I am often asking whether you can have a theory of value, but that's a different thing. So first, could you just go back and explain why Dewey thought you could not have a theory of beauty? And then what are the presuppositions for theorizing?
Yeah, I think there is some things here that I didn't explore for the time. It's a baby research, as I said, but the treatment that Dewey gives here to beauty, it's kind of the treatment that sometimes William James seems to give to aesthetics, or even Santayana, that is like, does not very a fan of explain and then put in analytical terms this theory. Is like this experience of art and beautiful is so much more than the words can explain, so it's kind of pointless to do it. And Dewey is trying to do about art, and I'm pretty sure, and I think everyone would agree that Dewey is doing much on the influence of Albert about art, but Barnes is not interested so much in the concept of beauty, and Dewey, for extension, it's not either, but it's a very important concept. So he ended to talking about, but concern and will never be. And even when later Dewey returns to aesthetics, sometimes he will quote the beauty in the same terms, and always saying that there is no theory of beauty, there is no beauty with capital B, like beauty, the beauty. So something to think about, why Dewey does not really thought it was possible to write a theory about beauty. For me, it's part of his theory. If he admit the beauty as a aesthetic apart, the theory will lose force. So maybe it's that, but thank you for the question. I will think about it.
Okay, let's move on to our next presenter. He's Livio Mattarollo. The title of his talk is Reconstruction in Democracy, Dewey on the Epistemic Import of Social Conflict. Livio Mattarollo holds a PhD in philosophy from the National University of La Plata. In 2025, he was appointed assistant researcher at CONICET. It's a huge achievement. He teaches at the undergraduate and graduate levels at the National University of La Plata and at the National University of Quilmes. He's a member of the Pragmatism Studies Group at the University of La Plata, and is involved in research projects on classical pragmatism, logic, argumentation theory, and philosophy education at the high school level. He has made a lot of research stays in wonderful and amazing universities, Ghent University, Bright University in Belgium, and in the National Center for Scientific Research in France. In 2023, he held a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Bologna in Italy, and he has received the University of La Plata Distinguished Award twice, and the Distinguished Student of Postgraduate Level once. Livio, the floor is yours.
Okay, so the title of my talk is Reconstruction in Democracy, Dewey on the Epistemic Import of Social Conflict. The field of my research is political epistemology. More precisely, I focus on the debate between epistemic democrats and epistocrats about the possibility of making an epistemic case for democracy. This is within the context of the epistemic turn in theories of democracy. And my aim today is to address this issue, or at least part of the issue, from a Deweyan perspective, in order to argue that it includes a crucial component of politics, which has been largely overlooked by recent literature. This is social conflict, and that Dewey's three-stage theory of social conflict allows for developing a more comprehensive epistemic case for democracy. So in general terms, epistocrats claim that voting rights should be distributed in accordance with citizens' levels of political knowledge. We could mention here Jason Brennan's provocative argument based on his diagnosis about the irrational and unreasonable electorate, but we could mention also Brian Kaplan, Ilya Soming, Achen and Bartels, among others. This proposal has received different responses from very different angles. Some of them focus on the epistemic problems of epistocracy, and some others focus on the epistemic advantages of democracy. In any case, what I see is that they tend to adopt quite a narrow view of politics, in the sense that they avoid making reference to the fact of social conflict. Actually, I completely agree with an insight provided by Michael Hannon and Elise Woodard in a quite recent book, 2025. They say that in this discussion, the participants tend to overlook the core function of politics. This is navigating and negotiating deep disagreements about the purposes and values of collective life. It is precisely at this point that I would like to bring classical pragmatism into the discussion. I think we all know that classical pragmatism is taken to be a very important reference to make epistemic cases for democracy. We could identify two main lines of argument: a Persian line of argument developed by Cheryl Misak and Robert Talisi, and a Deweyan line of argument started by Putnam or Honneth or even Habermas, and developed by Elizabeth Anderson, Matthew Feinstein, among others. Of course, these are not the only references. I think we could make reference to Shane Adams, for instance, but I think these are the most important ones. And at the same time, the notion of conflict is taken to be a crucial element to properly understand Dewey's view on inquiry, on education, on the moral of politics, in particular, after the discovery of the manuscripts of the conferences that Dewey delivered in China between 1919 and 1921, the idea of social conflict has taken to be crucial to properly understand Dewey's view on social philosophy and politics. So, my plan today is to analyze Dewey's three-stage theory of social conflict. I will focus on lectures in social and political philosophy as the main source, but I will take Dewey's major works on democracy as part of the background of my argument. I'll try to draw on a very interesting argument developed by Just Serrano Zamora. He's a colleague from Barcelona, based on the idea, he bases his argument on the idea of expressive domination, and I'll try to explore Dewey's account of the resolution of social conflict in order to propose a revised epistemic case for democracy from a Deweyan perspective. In lectures in social and political philosophy, Dewey proposes a third type of social philosophy, different from idealistic and conservative social philosophies, and aiming at directing necessary social changes by, and this is Dewey, the union of the scientific spirit with the moral and practical aim of philosophy. In another text, 1923 syllabus, Social Institutions and the Study of Morals, Dewey recovers this topic, and he claims that social philosophy, this pragmatist or third type of social philosophy, tries to carry further the process of reflective evaluation, which is found as an integral part of social phenomena. So we can see here that this proposal of this type of social philosophy has a very strong normative framework. I will say something about this in a few minutes. In lectures, but also in syllabus and previously in Reconstruction in philosophy, more or less at the same time, there are 4 or 5 years in between, Dewey identifies a series of basic human needs. Sometimes he says these are values. A few years ago, I tried to develop a reading of this point in terms of, he says these are interests. I try to develop this in terms of values. And there are corresponding social groups. And he defines a social group as a number of people associated for some purposes, some common activity that holds them. And groups are qualified by its capacity to satisfy a specific basic human need. And he also claims that social theory begins with conflicts between groups. This is the starting point of social theory. we can think here that social conflict is characterized by a failure in social integration. I take this from Roberto Frega. And the thing is that, according to Dewey, usually some particular form of association, and I think it's more interesting to point out that this is not only the form of association, but the pattern of human association related to that specific social group. It cuts across the other forms of human association and becomes monopolic. So the result is an unequal and unbalanced development of forms of life, and consequently a distinction between dominant and subordinated social groups whose growth is distorted. At this point, it is important to note, at least for my purposes today, that subordinated social groups are not even aware of the suppression, and they cannot introduce any idea about how to change social conditions. However, Dewey continues, sometimes social conditions may change, and they may foster discontent. So subordinated groups become aware of the suppressions, but they cannot find any proper channel to express the social demands. So this is a stage marked by some sense of individualism, meaning that these are only revolts against institutions, but they are not organized. And sometimes suppressed social groups can actually articulate the demands for needed social functions. I take the idea of articulation from Serrano Zamora and from Matteo Santarelli as well. So whenever this third stage is achieved, and this is not always the case, we find an organized challenge to the instituted social order. We know that Dewey is not naive at this point, and he acknowledges that it may include social struggle. Actually, the cases he identifies in the light of this three-stage account of social conflict are the feminist struggle, the labor movement struggle, and the scientific movement against the church about the epistemic authority. But the point is that at this third stage, the claim shifts from a right to a neglected social duty. In parallel, in lectures, Dewey includes, as I said, a normative framework. He says something like this: we can frame in imagination an ideal picture according to which a healthy social development is that in which, and this is Dewey, there is an equal proportionate development of all these forms of associated life, where they interact freely with one another and where the results of each one contribute to the richness and significance of every other. This ideal picture, Dewey says ideal picture, resembles his definition of democracy in Reconstruction in philosophy, but I think most importantly, in democracy and education. I think we all know this quotation about conjoint communicated experience and democracy as a way of life. So, in order to make a revised epistemic case for democracy, as I also said, I'll take this argument by Serrano Zamora as a starting point. He says that social problems are not given, and he's based on Dewey's logic theory of inquiry, but hermeneutically and practically articulated. This entails a commitment to inclusion and equal participation in order to avoid expressive domination, and to be more precise, to avoid the epistemic problems of expressive domination. I think this is an argument quite in tune with the Persian line of argument, in the sense that it derives a political commitment from an epistemic commitment. What I'd like to highlight rather is that, according to Dewey, the shift from the second to the third stage of social conflict amounts to the substitution of the method of opinion, he says, for the scientific method or method of intelligence. So any proposed social change should trace causes and consequences of actual and potential social institutions and arrangements. This is a long quotation from lectures. I won't read it. I just want to highlight that Dewey talks about hypotheses, and he talks about proposed measures of change that should be examined in the light of facts, of history, existing facts and conditions, and facts to be brought in. And my suggestion is that we could read this in the light of Dewey's definition of knowledge. I think one of the most interesting one is that from the quest for certainty, he says that the true object of knowledge resides in the consequences of directed action. So if that is the point, if that is the case, the resolution of social conflict, again, whenever the third stage is reached, it is not always the case, it seems that it should result from an inquiry leading to certain kind of knowledge, if we consider his definition of knowledge in the quest for certainty. So my idea is that the shift to the method of intelligence has an impact not only on the collective self-understanding of social groups, on the epistemic status of social facts, this is what Serrano Zamora says in 2017, not only on social problem articulation, this is what he says in 2020, but also on the resolution of the main social problem, this is the subordination of social groups. And if we consider all of this, I think we could make this case. If the ideal picture or democracy as a way of life states that there should be an equal, balanced, and proportionate development of all forms of associated life or social groups, and if proper resolution of social conflict results from a series of successive inquiries, it follows that the progressive achievement of democracy as a way of life carries the epistemic import of the resolution of social problems. At the most basic level of democracy as a way of life, at the core of democracy as a way of life, this is the level of the interaction between social groups. So my suggestion is that democracy as a way of life should be endorsed on epistemic grounds, because it is the ongoing result of the intelligent resolution of social conflict in order to create, and this is Dewey, a new action of social forces, bringing about a reconstruction of social groups and of their adjustment to one another. Just to conclude, I like to highlight three points. Firstly, Dewey's theory of social conflict allows us to recover a point that has been overlooked both by the literature on political epistemology and by most of the Deweyan-inspired literature on this topic. Secondly, that including social conflict into the analysis leads to a broader and deeper view of democracy than what epistemic democrats and epistocrats usually consider. This is what I mean by the idea of reconstruction in democracy. And thirdly, given that the main goal of social changes should be the equal and proportionate development of all groups and forms of associated life, according to the normative standard Dewey proposes in lectures in social and political philosophy, in democracy and education as well, considering democracy as an open result of an ongoing successive series of inquiries could complement the well-established Deweyan epistemic case for democracy, in the sense that, in my view, it articulates the political and the epistemic side of the discussion. I think that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I will be pleased to receive your comments.
Now we have minutes for questions, comments, suggestions. Okay, Juan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Livio, for your presentation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the notion of conflict. Because when I read the title of the presentation, I thought it was going to be something more related to different kinds of violence and coercion and kind of different kinds of social conflict, which we think of as opposed to like just conflicting opinions or opposing interests or something like that. Because if it's just a matter of conflicting opinions or opposing interests, I don't clearly see how this differs from, let's say, Putnam's or even like Elizabeth Anderson's reconstruction of Dewey's position, where you have like this idea of institutionalized fallibilism and way of like giving feedback to decisions and try like to find the facts and resolve a social problem in the way that takes everyone's point of view into account. So I was wondering if you have like a stronger conception of conflict and if it differs from just like different opinions that can be addressed through the method of science and inquiry. That's my question.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Shall I answer now? Okay. Thank you, Juan, for coming. It's a pleasure to see you here. Gracias, Juan, por la pregunta también. In lectures in social and political philosophy, I think he's not talking about conflict in the sense of opposition of interests. He's talking about a more radical type of conflict, when he claims that the point is that a pattern of human association tends to be monopolic. So the different social groups tend to follow an alien pattern of human association and tend to follow some different end, different from the so to say original idea or aim of that social group. We have to consider here that Dewey is talking about basic human needs that may be interest. This is based on his anthropology, of course. And for instance, one of the discussion he analyzes is feminism, and he says that the pattern of human association of family tend to monopolize, to colonize. Actually, I think he uses this verb, every form of human association. So it is not only about groups, it is not only about not even individuals, of course, but it's about how we organize our social life. So I think it's I'm not alone here. This is the reading, for instance, presented by Roberto Frega. It's a very radical type of social conflict, because we may have differences of interest and opinions within the context of the same pattern of human association. So this type of conflict is more radical. And this is why we can find in lectures different types or ways to achieve this normative framework. This says, okay, we can solve a problem, but we can, at a deeper level, modify the distribution of patterns of human associations. This is what feminism did at the time. They modify the main idea, the main guideline of every human association. So I think there's something else here, and I think this is the difference, for instance, between this approach and the approach in the public and its problems. I think the approach in the public and its problems is closer to what you try to say, if I am right. And I think this is a deeper approach. But he abandoned this project of a pragmatist social philosophy, and he recontextualized in some other way, for instance, in the public and its problem. I think it may be interesting for you to read this article by Roberto Frega on Dewey's theory of social conflict. Maybe you can find something better.
May I ask a mini follow-up?
Yes, if you wrap it in 30 seconds.
It's a tiny point. So my question was more like, how democracy handles this conflict? My question was about the input of the process. So what do you or Dewey in the lectures have in mind when you talk about like the feminist movement, for example? What do women give as an input to democracy as a general process of social cooperation? Because when I think of conflict, so I think, well, is it just a manifestation? It's not just votes, we are sure of that, but what is it?
No, it's to modify the way in which we relate to each other, to modify the pattern of our social relationships. It's not only say something in a demonstration or just to modify any particular institution, but in this sense, it seems to be deeper, and this is why it seems to be more difficult to achieve. Because first we have to acknowledge that there is a monopolic pattern of human association, and then we have to modify it. And these are the different stages of social conflict. Yeah, I would say that.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. Barbara, it's nice to see you. Go ahead.
clarify this for me. The shift from the second to the third stage of social conflict amounts to the substitution of the method of opinion for the. So are you saying that Dewey's not saying we should shift from the method of intelligence, right? It's that what typically happens in this third stage is that people start throwing opinions back and forth, and we got to get back to the method of intelligence? Or are you saying that Dewey recommends somehow that we use a method of opinion, and in what does that method of opinion consist?
Okay, thank you, Barbara. No, I will say that the point is to achieve the method of intelligence, to leave the method of opinion, and to achieve the method of intelligence.
Okay, so the third stage is marked by this tendency to let go of, or to not stay faithful to, a method of intelligence, and we got to get back to that.
Yes, we have to get the way to find proper channels to express the social demands, and to think what would happen if we modify social institutions in that way or another. This is why he points out the need for considering causes and consequences. And I think we could relate this to the imaginary essay, what would happen if we do this or that. In that sense, this is what I try to highlight. Maybe I didn't say it right, okay? So that may be my English. I'm sorry for that. But I think this is the point I try to highlight in the second part of this long quotation.
Germán, I will read, Matthew's comment and question. Recently, I have been thinking about what we might call the problem of elite non-compliance. Democracy is threatened by powerful members who are deeply anti-democratic. Wealthy people manipulating the media, racists, etc. What can us Deweyans say about how to deal with this barrier to democratic institutions and democracy, as a way of life?
That's, I think, one of the most important points. Sometimes I think that Dewey would, from my view, insist on this idea of including into the public discussion, right? We have to make an effort to include people into the public discussion, trying to achieve a wider public, when we think about the public and its problems. But some other times, I have to be honest with you, I think that if the difference between our interests and some others' interests is so huge, we cannot include them into the public discussion. So I tend to consider Dewey's standard of democracy in democracy and education. If interests can somehow coordinate, or at least live together and try to enrich each other, we can talk more or less in the same language. But if the difference is so important, we can't, like the group of thieves. They have a unified interest for them, but their interest cannot live with the interest of the whole society, of the whole social scenario. So I'm not sure, but I think that if we focus on democracy as a way of life, we have a limit there if we consider this standard of democracy as a way of life in terms of shared interests. And I think sometimes it's a useful limit to say, okay, this we can allow this, but we cannot allow this some other thing into the democratic scenario. But I would say I'm not sure. Thank you for the question.
Let's move on to our next presenter, myself. I will start with a very simple claim. I think that the concept of occupations has a relevance in Dewey's philosophy that has been largely overlooked by the literature. I consider that specifically when it comes to Dewey's experimentalism, the concept of occupation helps us to see the scope, of Dewey, the potential of Dewey's experimentalist proposal. Above all, if we try to connect experimentalism with, democratic education and democratic public spheres in general. Okay, I would like to start by emphasizing or by mentioning that there are common misunderstandings in Dewey's conception of democratic education that result from overlooking the evolution of his thought in the years leading up to democracy and education. I will briefly mention two of them. First, some contemporary philosophers of education have accused Dewey of failing to make his view on democratic education explicit. Linda Stone, for example, says that there is a missing link in Dewey's educational theory between democracy and schooling. I mean, she knows really well that Dewey develops a view on democracy and in education. She highlights that Dewey never is explicit or that Dewey never develops both concepts together, or at least that he doesn't so explicitly. Okay. On the other hand, Gerd Biester, probably another of the influential philosophers of education of our time, he says that there is a problem in Dewey's method theoretical commitments in his shift from absolutism to experimentalism. Okay, according to Biester, the effect of this shift is devastating. It turns democracy into a scientific case. Okay, when Dewey, shift from considering democracy a normative commitment, and he start to think in democracy as a scientific case, has an empirical hypothesis, democracy could be rejected. So this will be a problem because we are supposed to be very committed with democracy beyond the idea of an empirical hypothesis. Okay, so in this brief presentation, I will not address these two objections in detail. I mention them because they allow me to point to a strategy for responding to them, a strategy that also indicates how Dewey's educational philosophy should be interpreted. This strategy consists in reconstructing how Dewey thinks about the schooling during his Chicago periods, where he carries out this project of the laboratory school with his wife Alice, focusing on his experimentalism. Okay, Dewey's experimentalism in this context is not only the application of what he later calls the pattern of inquiry to the classroom, but also the consolidation of a model of educational theory that includes three aspects. Okay, I take this threefold division from the bearings of pragmatism upon education. Okay, first of all, the theory of the cars of study. Dewey says we need a centralizing factor for the curriculum, then a method of learning. Dewey advocates for learning by doing, as an alternative way of learning. And finally, a consideration about the moral and social ends of education. I think that the interconnection of these three elements is difficult to defend without considering the role that the idea of occupations plays in Dewey's educational theory. For this reason, I propose speaking of an occupation approach, understood as a way this notion operates across each of these three dimensions. Okay. In other words, I advocate a reconstruction of Dewey's experimentalism from the perspective of his occupation approach. I believe that such a reconstruction helps us move beyond the claim that something important is missing in Dewey's, view. Okay, let's move to the recent approaches to the concept of occupation. Okay, to up, we don't have a detailed reconstruction of the concept. I want to mention Anthony DeFalco, a retired professor from Long Island. He has written one amazing article at least, and he has the merit of putting the topic on the agenda. Okay, Some important studies have also clarified its educational significance. I would like to mention David Hildebrand in his Dewey, in his book, when he addresses educational theory, he reminds us that Dewey appeals to the concept of occupation to avoid the classist connotation that the concept of vocation has. David writes, I will quote, vocational or pre-professional training aggravates social class differences. Some in society are provided with a limited set of skills and information to do particular jobs, while others receive a more generous and humanizing liberal education, ending quotes. I think that David is right, and the Dewey's theory of education shows that a narrow conception of vocational education is totally misleading, okay? On the other hand, we have the analysis of John Quay. John Quay takes the idea of occupation as central, but he considers that there is something missing, in Dewey's conception of occupation, and he tries to reshape Dewey's conception of occupation within his, approach, his phenomenologist approach. I think that he moves too quickly toward his own view, and that he should maybe go into a detailed reconstruction of the concept. I mean, even though I consider his approach or his contribution valuable, okay? During the last 5 years, okay, I have been working on Dewey's experimentalism in the context of his philosophy of education. I argue that Dewey develops a form of educational experimentalism that involves a complex theoretical framework and represents the clearest precedent of democracy and education. To defend this claim, I focus on a specific period of Dewey's work, from the brief text, The Variance of Pragmatism Upon Education, by 1908, 1909, until Democracy and Education itself. I take as a starting point the Variance because it's the first text where Dewey itself recognizes himself as a pragmatist without any further clarification, okay? He says, okay, the best theory in educational theory is a pragmatist one, okay? I maintain that during these Chicago years, Dewey develops the connection between democracy and schooling. When Dewey writes Democracy and Education, he assumes this development as already established. If we don't examine the whole picture, we might conclude that Dewey does not really develop a theory of schooling, okay? If we don't take into consideration these preceding years. According to my analysis, there are two fundamental senses of experimentalism in Dewey. We have an anthropological sense, according to which experimentalism describes the developments of human intelligence from early childhood to more complex forms of individual and social inquiry. I think that in the preface of how we think Dewey succinctly expresses this idea. He says, the native and unspoiled attitude of childhood, marked by ardent curiosity, fertile imagination, and love of experimental inquiry, is very near to the attitude of the scientific mind. Ending quotes. On the other hand, we have an epistemological sense. Experimentalism refers to a pattern of inquiry, a complete act of thought that explains scientific inquiry, aesthetic experience, and ordinary intelligence. This also includes how we live the experience, this aspect that has been, emphasized by Gregory's interpretation of Dewey's, the empirical method, and, I think that these two senses tend to overlap. When we say, for example, that Dewey's pedagogy is experimental, we mean both that he describes children's development by appealing to this evolutionary psychology and biology, and on the other hand, that we organize educational theory from this structure of problem solving that he describes in How We Think and his epistemological text, okay? I consider that these two senses are not incoherent, but they are not problematic until we think in Dewey's democratic conception of education. There is a concern that Dewey makes explicit from democracy and education, more or less, onwards. When it comes to Dewey's conception of democratic education, if we think the connection experimentalism and democratic education, the problems arise. I believe that these problems can be neutralized by reconstructing experimentalism through the lens of occupations, okay? I will give two examples by taking into consideration two common confusions in Dewey's, educational theory. The first is that Dewey has been criticized for defending a conception of learning by doing that sounds too general and sometimes difficult to implement, okay? In this interpretation, to be experimental would simply mean testing general concepts introduced, for example, by a teacher. I think that Dewey might not disagree with this form of testing, but his idea of learning by doing involves something more. It requires understanding learning as situated within an intersubjective context of practical engagement. And I think that the occupations approach provides that, future. A second misreading is the claim that Dewey's experimentalism doesn't involve a moral commitment when it comes to educational theory. In practical terms, this would mean that Dewey's pedagogy could support either democratic education or non-democratic education. In other words, this objection assumes that Dewey's method of learning can be separated from his defense of democratic education. Okay? In fact, there is examples of the application of Dewey's pedagogy in the context, for example, of Franquism in Spain. Okay? There are an amazing article that, tells this story. I will remember the name of the author later. Sorry. Perhaps the claim that every learning context should be a democratic one will be too strong. I know that. Dewey himself maybe never formulates such a thesis. However, when Dewey uses occupation as a criterion for organizing the curriculum, he attempts to promote a particular kind of learning, one in which students are genuinely interested and practically engaged in joint activities. Dewey was very concerned with preserving children's interests without falling into the defense of a purely child-centered curriculum. An education organized through occupation establishes this balance. A community that learns through occupation does not automatically become a democratic community. However, this form of learning is characteristic of democratic life. For that reason, it is essential to understand Dewey's educational experimentalism in light of this idea of occupation. I would like to highlight, the main points of this brief presentation. Okay, many misunderstandings come from not taking into consideration the years leading up to democracy and education, and I think that this is especially evident when we try to understand Dewey's experimentalism in his educational theory. I consider that if we understand experimentalism throughout the idea of occupation without forgetting the relevancy of this concept in Dewey's framing, we would avoid important confusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. I have a question that perhaps it's more biographical of Dewey's development of educational theory and philosophy of education. After the closing of Dewey's school in Chicago, where for what I know, he applied a democratical system of education along with a occupations approach. Is there an impact of that biographical fact in his writings from 1904 onwards, or can we talk about some independence of his life and work in that matter?
Okay. Thank you, Herman. If I understand you well, you are asking about the connection, the impact of this experience of the laboratory school in Dewey's writing, doing maybe style. That is an interesting question, because Dewey, for example, wrote, I think, two texts straightforwardly connected with the experience of the laboratory school. On the one hand, how we think, that is pretty evident because in the preface Dewey says, okay, this is the result of my experience in the laboratory school. It's interesting because maybe not in the style of writing. Dewey makes reference to, to classroom, to concrete experiences. But for example, when we gives examples of experimental method, he doesn't appeal to classroom examples, okay? But the idea of classroom and the environment of class is, I think that is present along that book. But I think that in the school of tomorrow, we could find, even though Dewey doesn't describe, Dewey and his daughter don't describe both of them, the experience of the laboratory school. In that book, you can see the relevance to describe the concrete experience in classroom, okay? Which is something that is not present in how we think. But I follow, giving you a quick answer, I would say that totally, the experience of the laboratory school impacts in Dewey's writing. Maybe it's more, he takes for granted the necessity of a more narrative style when it comes to philosophy of education. Thank you for that question, Herman. Okay, Barbara.
Can I add to that a couple things? One is, at this time that he's running the lab school in Chicago, he's also deeply involved with Jane Addams' Hull House, and he's obviously very much impacted by his wife Alice, as you said, Juan, and by the Mayhews. I can't remember their names, but the two sisters who helped
Evelyn, I think.
Yeah, but in any case, so
Yeah.
he's sort of living his way through that. But I would also say, I would also cite the School and Society and the Child and Curriculum. So these things are published in 1899, I want to say, but it's a series of lectures as he's getting the lab school going about what the lab school is, and it very much addresses the question of occupations. But I think it also, the experimentalism is there already, not in any fully formed way, but it's there already. And really, anytime after the reflex arc concept in philosophy, or in psychology, which is 1896, I want to say.
Yeah.
So the experimentalism is there, even if he's not calling it experimentalism, I think.
Thank you, Barbara. And I totally agree. In Dewey, happens always that he has the idea before to put in the name. So thank you for letting me know this, okay, in my interpretation.
Yeah.
Matthew?
Thank you for your talk, Juan. I really like the way in which you carefully distinguished Dewey's notion of the role of occupations in education from traditional vocational tracking in education. But I wonder if you could speak to how we would distinguish it from the current view under the kind of neoliberal interpretation of the aims of education as the provisioning of job credentials, right? And like, what would your Deweyan response to that sort of notion of the occupational aims of education be?
Okay. Thank you, Matt, for your question. It's true that according to the liberal approach of education, it's like if the curriculum should be organized by taking as the criteria benefit. Okay, that would be, the in a nutshell, the official position of a liberal view on education. On the other hand, it's true that Dewey thought his occupational approach in line with industrialism. Okay, maybe you know the experience of industrialism, the growing industrialism, and at Dewey's time, in a certain way, conditioned Dewey's position. I mean, I would say this straightforwardly. I think that Dewey was very optimistic about industrialism. Okay, we could, you know, how can I say, criticize Dewey for maybe not taking into consideration certain consequences of industrial education. Dewey speaks in terms of industrialist democracy and wherever. I understand that. I would say that we need to rethink, you know, what, for example, are the occupations in our current times that, you know, would be necessary to, how can I say, to restate or to reassess, sorry, Dewey's proposal. Because we cannot think, for example, in cooking, sewing, and growing vegetable as occupation that nowadays are activities with social meaning that Dewey, you know, defines the idea of occupation. At the beginning of 20th century, maybe growing vegetables and cooking were, you know, occupations in the strict sense. I mean, in conclusion, I think that our task is to try to rethink what occupations are now valuable for our times. But I have an intuition. I consider that we live in a time when we do everything by our own without any help of a community. We are living time of individualism as a value, you know, as a sort of dogma. So, for example, we talk in terms of learn about everything. And learning is something that sometimes is individual. Dewey offers a pedagogy or a kind of learning that is that involves a community. So I think that maybe the idea that there are advantages in terms of value, okay, that a community of learning has in comparison with individual learning, maybe in that we have a possible answer to your very important question, okay? I think that, okay, we could say what Dewey was proposing was to, how can I say, in line with education for benefit. Okay, that is a possible interpretation. But on the other hand, in our times, the idea of that learning is something that involves necessarily a community is a divergent idea. And it's an idea that is totally at odds with, you know, a liberal conception of work even. Okay? So I think that I don't have a direct question. I will keep thinking about it. Thank you for that. But this is my intuitions, okay? Okay. I think that we are done here. Thank you for attending this meeting. Thank you for your questions, for your suggestions, for your patience. And I will give you the, thank you, Livio, for your presentation. Laura, you know that you are, for me, one of the most talented young scholars from the South. I give you the word to Matt. I want to thank you, Matt, for this opportunity of sharing our ideas.